Has anyone ever told you that you had a biochemical imbalance? Did you go to the doctor feeling anxious or stressed or depressed and have them say, oh yeah, it's genetic, it's biochemical, you need a psychiatric drug? Well, you might be surprised to learn that the only biochemical imbalances in the brains of people who see psychiatrists are the ones put in there by the psychiatrists. We don't have any evidence that any routine psychiatric problem, from anxiety to depression and even schizophrenia, has anything to do with a biochemical imbalance. So where did an idea like that come from? We know the answer. It was actually made up by the brilliant minds at the drug company Eli Lilly. Even before Prozac was approved for depression by the FDA, Lilly was sending its minions, its paid physicians and consultants, out into the world to say that depression was caused by a biochemical imbalance, and in particular, a kind of sluggish serotonin neurotransmitter, just not enough serotonin working.
There is no antidepressant that will cure a depression that's spiritually based, for the malaise doesn't originate from brain dysfunction, but from an accurate response to the desecration of life. Hello, welcome to Awake in the Age of Revealing. This is Doug Michael. It is April 7th, 2014 at the time of this recording. The title of today's segment is The Psychological Manipulation of Human Consciousness, Psychotropic Drugs, and Existential Death. Now, that above quote from David Hawkins absolutely sums up my feelings concerning the explosive growth of the use of antidepressant drugs, particularly over the last decade. Now, SSRI, which stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitor, is a class of drug used to treat anxiety, depression, personality disorders, and chronic pain, among other uses. In 1996, the number of people being treated with SSRIs was roughly 13 million and increased to a staggering 27 million in 2005. Over 164 million prescriptions for SSRIs were written in 2008 in America alone. Why has there been this massive increase in such a short time? In my view, the problem is an existential one and not a medical one. Now, serotonin is a major contributor to feelings of well-being, mood, appetite, sleep, and also has cognitive functions relating to memory and learning. It is biochemically derived from tryptophan and is mostly located in the gastrointestinal tract, with roughly 20% in the central nervous system. Antidepressants are being more and more widely prescribed for a growing list of, quote, disorders, and there have been numerous incidents of horrific side effects, including murders and suicides, specifically related to the adverse reactions of these mind-altering antipsychotic drugs. SSRIs are massively overprescribed and given out like candy, often even to children as young as 3 years old. Now, might this massive overprescribing of SSRIs have something to do with the tens of billions in profits that the sales of those drugs generate? Well, of course it does, but as always, there is something far more sinister to this agenda to dispense mind-numbing drugs for every conceivable disorder, real or contrived, and it has to do with chemically lobotomizing the human brain. Now, that beginning clip was by Dr. Peter Breggin, author of the book Toxic Psychiatry, very outspoken expert on the negative effects of such drugs as Ritalin and Prozac and antidepressants and the stuff we're going to talk about today. The notorious Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of Prozac, has generated well over $20 billion in sales since the drug's approval in 1987. It has also paid out billions in lawsuits and settlements due to the adverse effects of its harmful drugs such as Prozac and its antipsychotic drug Zyprexa, which has been linked to causing diabetes. Eli Lilly is also the manufacturer of thimerosal, a vaccine additive derived from mercury, which has now been shown to be linked to autism. In 2003, the same year that the FDA issued a warning concerning Zyprexa, the drug grossed $4.28 billion. In the same year, Eli Lilly's second most lucrative drugs were anti-diabetes medications, which grossed $2.51 billion. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. And in fact, SSRI drugs have been the most widely prescribed medications for Americans in the past 20 years. Drugs such as Celexa, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, and Lexapro, among many others, are given to hundreds of millions of people each year to treat disorders, which usually have no basis in medical fact. These dangerous drugs are used to treat chemical imbalance, an alleged disorder for which absolutely no evidence exists linking it to depression. And to reiterate the opening little clip from Dr. Peter Breggin, and again, he studied extensively the effects of SSRIs and other dangerous drugs. And he stated quite simply, if you have got a biochemical imbalance in your brain, the odds are overwhelming that your doctor put it there with a psychiatric drug. There are no biological tests that exist to determine if a person is chemically imbalanced or clinically depressed. Those diagnoses come solely from behavioral tests and are the determining factor in the treatment of depression with potentially harmful toxic medications. There are numerous incidents of people engaging in the most horrific displays of violence when coming off of antidepressant medications too quickly. These powerful mind-altering drugs rewire the brain, changing the chemistry and physiology, and when they are stopped too abruptly, psychosis is often the result. Now, why do so many people seem to be okay with taking these types of medications in the first place? Is it because they are looking for a way to cope with the increasing insanity we survey in our world and the rapid societal collapse and degeneration? Can deep existential problems be solved by taking pills? Now we are taught ever increasingly that our darker emotions are something to be feared and scorned, something to avoid at all costs. Only the eccentric psychologists and wacky philosophers teach that embracing the darker emotions is necessary and beneficial. Our modern medical and psychiatric establishments teach the opposite, that escapism from these emotions is the answer. It is in the action of seeking escape from these darker emotions through the use of powerful drugs that can often cause true psychotic breaks and insanity. We don't want to hear that. My doctor said they're okay, and besides, I don't want to feel those feelings anyway. Deal with my dark side? I don't think so. Now shut up and pass the Prozac. Masses of people will willingly ingest psychotropic or SSRI drugs to try to adjust to an increasingly declining cultural reality. Now, as the great teacher Jiddu Krishnamurti has said, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Now, rather than ever entertaining the notion that the societal breakdown that we see unfolding by the day is a product of consciousness shattering, of deep existential problems within the psyche of humanity, so many instead seek to medicate away the warning signs while filling the coffers of the pharmaceutical industry. The billions paid out in lawsuits by the industry is a drop in the bucket compared to the tens of billions generated in profits each year by companies such as Eli Lilly or Forest Laboratories, the manufacturer of a popular SSRI drug called Celexa. Now, our dark side is the unconscious mind. It is a part of our personalities. It is the dumping grounds for all of the horrible things that we repress about our lives. We dump into the unconscious all of those things about ourselves that we cannot bear to face. But sooner or later, the stench of the rotting garbage begins to invade, and it is then that people will go to any lengths to avoid facing that aspect of their own psyche. If you want to see what the results are of avoiding the dark side of the personality, just look at the crumbling civilization all around you, because that is the mirror reflecting back at us the results of deep, unworked inner trauma. Now, as the pioneer of analytical psychology, Carl Jung, has stated, he said, whatever is rejected from the self appears in the world as an event. In other words, the things about the personality that we refuse to deal with or seek to medicate away will appear in space and time in manifested reality to reflect back at us all that needs healing. This is done on an individual level and also on a collective level in the aggregate. Surveying the world of today, it becomes obvious that very deep and profound healing is necessary. Now, I would suggest that the act of willfully avoiding dealing with the unconscious to the point of rewiring the brain's chemistry is akin to self-murder and causes one to suffer a sort of existential death. We would rather murder that part of ourselves than face what could in effect be our greatest teacher. In 2009, scientists announced, check this one out now. In 2009, scientists announced that drugs were being developed that could actually erase bad memories from the brain. Now, Dutch researchers are working on this. They claim success in this endeavor with the use of beta blockers. Now, the truly disturbing thing is that many people would flock to get their hands on such drugs by erasing the part of the mind that deals with repression and bad memories. The totality of the overall being would be shattered. The unconscious or shadow is a part of the personality. Simply medicating it out of existence would be the first great leap into the experience of existence as a post-human being. You cannot medicate away the dark side of life and expect to ever be a complete and total being. Now, if the use of these types of memory-destroying drugs ever comes into widespread use, and I imagine that they will, human consciousness will be even more shattered than it is now, and sadly, that is the idea behind the push to permeate the culture with psychotropic drugs. SSRI drugs have been linked to increased risk of strokes, obesity, diabetes, birth defects, and other serious complications. Through the course of my research, I've looked at quite a lot of forums on the web, related to SSRI usage among people. I mean, by now I've read thousands and thousands of accounts. I've noticed a very high percentage that claim that after being on SSRIs for extended periods, that the drugs actually diminished their ability to feel or experience emotionally in the same way. Many people who are prescribed these drugs become emotionally numb permanently. And I've also witnessed this firsthand with a few people in my life over the years. They may feel better in the short term, but eventually they seem to become distant and emotionally dead. Now, there's a freelance journalist out there by the name of Jim Stone. He received about 30,000 pages of documents from a concerned whistleblower who was working for GlaxoSmithKline, the manufacturers of Prozac. Stone concluded, among other horrors, that these documents confirm that it is well known among antidepressant manufacturers that their products permanently damage or destroy the emotional existence of those who take them, even after years of being off the drugs. Now, Stone's research concluded that over time, SSRI drugs permanently destroy the neurons in the frontal lobes of the brain, the area of the brain that deals with emotion. In my perspective, once the emotional centers are destroyed, a person is no longer quite human. Think about it, we're emotional beings. We have a broad range of emotions. You destroy the area of the brain that deals with them, you're less than human. Now, Stone went on. He said, the drugs are specifically designed to cause the death of most, if not all, of the frontal lobes, leaving those who take them expressing emotion via memory of what should be expressed rather than via genuine feeling. The mode of action is to cause emotional neurons to switch on until they die from overexertion. After repeated regeneration of emotional neurons, followed by repeated cellular death, a period of time taking 9 months on average, Most people who take antidepressants remain emotionally muted, if not completely dead, with only the ability to feel anger, fear, or nothing remaining. After reading these documents, I have concluded that antidepressants are the root cause of the cold-heartedness and selfishness now becoming prevalent in American society. Now, children are being targeted on a massive scale also. It's gotten so outrageous that the psychiatric industry, in a lockstep with the pharmaceutical leviathan, is targeting infants. A recent study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry claimed that there are new ways to detect schizophrenia in newborn infants. This despite the fact that there are no medical tests in existence to determine schizophrenia or to even show that it's a brain anomaly. So you see the agenda behind this? The idea is to get kids on these drugs as early as possible, thereby preventing full development of a functional brain. The agenda is to stifle human potential or to never let it flourish in the first place. I'm going to repeat that because that really is it in a nutshell. The agenda is to stifle human potential or to never let it flourish in the first place. Antipsychotic medications have been shown to shrink the brain. If a child begins taking these lobotomizing drugs in early infancy, the brain will simply never develop correctly, nor will that person ever be a complete being. They will be dumbed down, servile, post-human automatons in love with their servitude. And again, that's the idea. The quacks behind this agenda to drug babies call it, quote, preventative mental health. Preventative mental health. Now, over the last decade, the psychiatric community has dramatically expanded, they've dramatically expanded their list of what can be characterized as a, quote, disorder. It's gotten so ridiculous that choosing to consume healthy foods is now classified as a disorder. And they call this concern with eating healthy, they call it orthorexia nervosa. Orthorexia. I mean, could you imagine, say being at a party or something, right? Hey, look at Jessica always eating those salads and fresh fruits. I think she may be an orthorexic. It's ridiculous. And of course, they don't have a disorder for consuming genetically modified processed garbage, right? If you choose to eat organic foods, whole foods, then you're a mental case. Just take these brain-shrinking, mind-numbing, toxic drugs and you'll be okay, darling. Trust us. We're the experts. There are hundreds of disorders claimed by the psychiatric community, all of which are voted upon by members of panels, as opposed to, any actual science being involved. The more nebulous disorders they can concoct, the more drugs can be pushed on the population to the tune of endless billions. This must be the only profession in which the doctors can simply make up diseases and treat them with pharmaceuticals. The Psychiatric Association will even admit that to this day, they do not know what causes mental illness. But perhaps the brilliant psychologist R.D. Laing, who studied schizophrenia extensively, was onto something when he claimed, he said, the experience and behavior that gets labeled schizophrenic is a special strategy that a person invents in order to live in an unlivable situation. Now, Laing also claimed that insanity is a, quote, perfectly rational adjustment to an insane world. Now, globally, some 450 million people are labeled with some disorder or other based on the DSM, which is a Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. This is the industry's Bible of quack pseudoscience. This psychiatric manual keeps getting more voluminous every year as more disorders are simply invented out of thin air. Now, according to the psychiatric community, thinking outside of the consensus or challenging authority is now a mental disorder, which they have labeled oppositional defiant disorder. Can you imagine this? Questioning authority is a mental disorder. Talk about collectivism. Sales of psychotropic drugs rake in an astounding $27 billion annually. Total funding from various world governments grosses psychiatry a staggering $450 billion a year. Are you starting to get the picture as to why we have seen such a massive increase in prescriptions to treat every contrived ailment with psychotropic drugs and the sudden and massive explosion in so-called disorders? Again, there is much more behind this than merely profiting immensely off of misery. The idea is to reduce the human being to the level of a machine. Look at the amount of people that will simply do what they are told, all on the say-so of some expert. Sadly, a very high percentage will willingly attempt to medicate out of existence the parts of themselves that they cannot or will not face. Right now, upwards of 17 million school children are currently medicated with psychotropic drugs such as Ritalin or with SSRIs. There is a long list of students who have engaged in disturbing acts such as school shootings, who have coincidentally been treated with these drugs. Prozac has come under scrutiny for being connected to causing side effects of violent outbreaks in people medicated with it. In 1991, an FDA panel consisting of 9 members, 5 of which were connected to pharmaceutical companies, 2 of whom were working for Eli Lilly. This panel concluded that Prozac did not require a violence warning in order to be marketed. Eli Lilly has settled a number of violence claims out of court. In fact, by the end of 1994, 150 Prozac lawsuits had been filed. As of 1992, there were 23,067 officially filed adverse side effects to Prozac reported. Of those officially filed reports, there were 1,313 deaths reported and 1,436 suicide attempts. And in 1992, Prozac had only been on the market for 4 years. That's not a very good track record. Now, Prozac and other antidepressants change the physiology of the brain and can lead to mania or violent outbreaks. People that suddenly stop taking these powerful drugs often react aggressively or fall into deep, often suicidal depression. These often harmful antidepressants have been massively overprescribed globally, and I know people personally that probably shouldn't be on drugs such as Prozac, but they are anyway. They never seem to even bother to research potential side effects of the mind-bending drugs they ingest unquestioningly, or to even look at both sides of an argument. You see, a doctor or a shrink recommended the drug, so it must work. Of course, the research showing the drugs to be safe was provided by the very companies that manufacture them, but most doctors and patients will have no idea of this. Do you think they're going to find anything wrong with the drugs they're trying to market and make billions and billions off of? Of course not. And with regards to what I just said, good luck trying to warn your friends or loved ones about the dangers of these drugs. The industry's connections to corrupted political leaders or the lawsuits. The person or authority that they give their power away to, the expert, the doctor or shrink, has prescribed the drugs, so it's okay. How dare you offer information that just may save their life? If you don't have a degree from an accredited university or letters after your name, then what the hell do you know? Now, I've personally received that completely ignorant attitude more times than I care to remember. On one occasion, many years ago, someone I know asked me to research for him the potential side effects of Prozac because his shrink had recommended the drug, and he, of course, did not have the motivation to research for himself. So I provided him with numerous documents that clearly established what I'm outlining here today. Now, of course, he ignored the information and took the drugs anyway. Now, I find it curious that people will not even be bothered looking into the potential side effects of drugs that they're considering taking. This is just one example of the deep and comprehensive level of mind conditioning prevalent in so many. We have been taught to distrust our own perceptions, thoughts, emotions, ideas, and intuitions and abandon them instead for the expert opinion of someone with a $150,000 education. If that works for you, then go for it. But don't condemn the ones that actually have the courage and the balls to stand up, speak out, and ask questions. Not to sound cold-hearted, but perhaps those that are too lazy to do some homework or think for themselves deserve the chemical lobotomy they so willingly embrace. Now, the sad thing is when their failure to be informed affects their children. I don't doubt that some people with legitimate mental illnesses may benefit in some way from these types of drugs. However, it is the massive overprescribing of these drugs and the effects of them that must be scrutinized. Now, incidentally, Ritalin, the drug most commonly prescribed to treat ADD and ADHD, attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, this drug Ritalin happens to be in the amphetamine family. Now, the World Health Organization and the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, both place Ritalin in the same category as methamphetamine, speed, and cocaine. Drugs that fall under the amphetamine category have the highest potential for abuse and addiction. In fact, Ritalin is in effect legal speed. And there have never been any conclusive tests to determine the long-term effects of Ritalin. However, short-term research has shown that the drug actually alters the physiology of the brain, just like the SSRIs do. Brookhaven National Laboratories in Long Island, New York, has shown, utilizing brain scans, that the drug Ritalin actually cuts the blood and oxygen supply to the brain. And Ritalin's manufacturer even warns that, quote, frank psychotic episodes can occur with abuse. Give that shit to your children. Leon Eisenberg, the, quote, father of ADHD, right, just recently admitted in his last interview before his death that ADHD is a, quote, prime example of a fictitious disease. This is the father of ADHD here, saying this right before he died. What, do you have a stroke of conscience, I guess? ADHD is a prime example of a fictitious disease, he said. So they're getting your kids hooked on fucking amphetamines based on a lie. A 30-page report concerning the use and abuse potential of Ritalin was compiled by the DEA in 1995. In part, the report stated that, quote, there is an abundance of scientific literature which indicates that methylphenidate, Ritalin, shares the same abuse potential as other Schedule II stimulants, such as crystal meth and cocaine. According to the DEA's report, then, Ritalin is a highly addictive stimulant. Now, what begins to happen to many children and adults alike who are treated with the drug Ritalin and others like it is that they begin to become depressed. Most stimulant drug users tend to after a while. Now they're treated for a new condition, clinical depression, with what? Yet more drugs. The drugs used for the treatment of depression are Luvox, Prozac, Paxil, and an array of other SSRI drugs. Incidentally, research has shown that these antidepressants can induce mania or suicidal tendencies, as mentioned. Now, mania is a condition that can result in aggressive behavior. It is a condition of psychosis, which often can lead to destructive, violent plans resulting in mass murder or suicide. According to Solvay, the producer of the drug Luvox, 4% of children and youth taking Luvox developed mania during short-term controlled clinical trials. A case in point is Eric Harris, one of the shooters in the Columbine massacre on April 20th, 1999. Harris was treated with Luvox and his autopsy report showed low therapeutic levels of the drug in his system. Now lately, there have been a number of parents that give their healthy kids Ritalin at exam time in hopes that it will improve their academic performance. Think of that. These brain-dead parents that are doing this are obtaining the drugs over the internet, from countries, say, such as Canada, where it's not so regulated. Can you imagine this, though? Imagine this for a second. Parents drugging their kids simply because they want them to get higher grades. It's appalling, yes, but it's happening quite a bit. Now, another issue of grave concern is the fact that Ritalin is being dealt by kids in schools just as illegal drugs are. It's been shown quite conclusively that altering the diets of children and removing or limiting processed, sugary, unhealthy foods improves behavior and performance drastically. There have even been some school districts which have adopted a more holistic approach to diet with remarkable positive results. What a radical idea, huh? That processed, genetically modified junk food can have negative effects on behavior, academic performance, well-being, concentration, mood, and overall brain function, right? No. Keep feeding little Johnny over-processed microwavable garbage and just give him these Schedule II amphetamines and he'll be just fine. And then further studies of Ritalin have concluded the unwanted side effects are problems with eating and sleeping, possible negative effects on cognition and self-image, and rare or disputable increases in motor or verbal tics. There is no long-term evidence of improvement of children taking Ritalin. No improvement in academic outcome can be attributed solely to its effects. No decrease in antisocial behavior or arrest rates, and only small effects on learning and achievement. There exist no neurological, physiological, or biochemical means to predict or determine responses to Ritalin. Ritalin does not improve complex skills such as reading, athletic ability, and social behavior. Grades may improve, but Ritalin cannot correct a learning disability. Ritalin does not improve significant emotional problems. No pills do. The WHO concluded that Ritalin is the most addictive drug in medical use. Think about that now. The World Health Organization concludes that Ritalin is the most addictive drug in medical use, handed out to school children like fucking Pez candy. Recent studies conducted by Brookhaven National Laboratories conclude that Ritalin is in fact more potent than cocaine. As of 1998, about 1 out of 5 school children have been prescribed Ritalin. And DEA statistics show that Ritalin production and use increased 700% between 1991 and 1998. What must the number be today? As stated, antidepressants have been administered regularly to young children as well, and mindless parents simply accept the drugging of their kids on the say-so of some expert. Now, among the many adverse side effects linked to Prozac and other SSRIs are, and this is just a partial list, okay? Abnormal dreaming, allergic reaction, flu symptoms, bronchitis, stomach or intestinal disorders, tremors, abnormal ejaculation, stoppage of menstrual flow, amnesia, arthritis, breast cysts, convulsions, excessive bleeding, hallucinations, hostility, ovarian disorders, paranoia, among many, many other side effects. So, why is this harmful drug still on the market? Now, could one of the main reasons be the fact that in 2006, Eli Lilly posted third quarter profits of $3.8 billion? Children in preschool, as young as 3, have been prescribed Prozac and other antidepressants. 3 years old, Now, leaving aside the idea that a kid might come from a broken home or a very messed up situation, what the hell does a 3-year-old have to be depressed about, right? What, did they cancel SpongeBob? What, he lost his blue crayon? I mean, how is depression diagnosed in a small child anyway? It's diagnosed purely on behavioral tests, which are used as guides to administer such drugs. Often the tests contain criteria that are very common among children. And what must the moron parents be thinking to put their toddlers on these heavy drugs such as Prozac? Oh, that's right. A psychiatrist said it's okay, so there's no need to question or think at all. Incidentally, The long-term effects of Prozac are unknown because it hasn't been around that long. Young children are prescribed these heavy drugs for conditions such as selective mutism, which basically means that they're shy. Get that kid on drugs. Now, in April 2002, former President G.W. Bush established the New Freedom Commission on Mental Health to, quote, conduct a comprehensive study on the U.S. mental health delivery system. Yeah, I mean the drugs. In 2004, the Commission's report called the New Freedom Initiative was published, which calls for comprehensive mental screening for all school children, preschoolers, and consumers of all ages. The Commission cited the Texas Medication Algorithm Project, or TMAP, as a guideline for medication treatment plans, and it's certainly no surprise that the TMAP guidelines encourage the use of newer and more expensive antidepressant drugs, and that the project was funded by several pharmaceutical companies that have contributed heavily to the election funds of G.W. Bush. No conflict of interest here. The TMAP board is made up of individuals from drug companies, what a surprise, the Mental Health and Correction System of Texas, and the University of Texas, and some of its members have direct ties to the New Freedom Commission on Mental Health. We will witness an exponential increase in the number of prescribed SSRI drugs over the next several years, and it's crucial that people become aware of this agenda to mass medicate and to resist it. The drug companies and corrupted political misleaders with connections to them have no problem with profiting in the billions while destroying people's lives. In fact, it's their modus operandi. Now, an understanding of the history of what we call psychiatry paints a morbid picture of the foundations of this massively lucrative field. The psychiatric establishment claims that some 1 billion people in the world are mentally ill. There is an informative documentary out there. It's a film called Psychiatry, an Industry of Death, that brilliantly exposes the dark side of this industry. The film points out that over the last 40 years, there have been 1.1 million deaths in government psychiatric hospitals. Now, that's more than all American deaths that have occurred in every U.S. war combined since 1776. But like everything else the consortium network is behind, this is an industry that profits massively from death and destruction. Because if we can kill you while we profit immensely, then all the better to these psychopaths. The upper echelon of the consortium and their lower-level minions see humanity as animals to be experimented on and as human resources and nothing more. The mentally ill are the most expendable, it seems, as the horrific treatment of these people throughout history clearly demonstrates. Now, the history of psychiatry began in these asylums in England. One of the first was an institution of torture called Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and was commonly referred to as Bedlam. Patients were confined to cages and animal stalls, and they were routinely beaten. Admission was charged for public viewings of torture of the undesirables. Now, in the 18th century, Dr. William Batty, funny, like the truth is in the name right there, Dr. Batty claimed that his institutions could cure the insane. His institutions made him one of the richest men in England, despite the fact that his methods never cured a single person. Batty's methods consisted of inhumane torture. After Batty's enormous success, the asylum business began to boom in England and in America. These institutions were not hospitals at all, but they were hellish dens where absolute torture could be conducted on human beings with no oversight and no legal repercussions. Severe punishments were undertaken and called treatment. Now, the American Dr. Benjamin Rush theorized that mental illness was caused by too much blood in the brain and developed a treatment of bloodletting, which included the use of sick devices designed to torture the victims of his erroneous ideas. Rush is considered the grandfather of psychiatry. Now, the early history of psychiatry is one filled with what can best be described as no less than sadistic torture. Let's call it what it is. Dr. Henry Cotton practiced mutilation on his patients and routinely removed their body parts and claimed that this was a breakthrough in treatment of the mentally ill. I mean, it's not funny, but I'm sitting here laughing at the insanity of this. Yeah, people would buy into this shit, you know? After enormous public outcry, psychiatry worked to try to establish itself as a medical discipline due to its abysmal failure to cure and to threats to its financial stability. Now, in 1879, Professor Wilhelm Wundt of Germany declared that man's thoughts, behaviors, and personality were nothing more than chemical reactions, thereby reducing humanity to the level of a soulless animal. This was the birth of what would later become known as behaviorism. And ladies and gentlemen, the people at the top that control everything from behind the scenes, they are psychopathic, and this is the ideology that they believe in. They see human beings as just animals without any kind of spiritual component. And there's people in the world working night and day to enact these kind of philosophies. They're doing a wonderful job at it. Now, Wundt believed that man was simply an animal, and this is the mentality, again, that the consortium embraces, encourages, and seeks to bring into full fruition through its networks and those that slavishly serve them. This philosophy views humans as something to be trained like animals, not understood as the living soul that we all truly are. This purely materialistic view of humanity predominates and has been the cause of so many problems and is based in purely false ego consciousness. Wundt's philosophies inspired people like Ivan Pavlov, who conducted horrific animal experiments in the pursuit of behavior modification. His work became the foundation for behavioral sciences, and his human experiments were no less cruel than his predecessors. Now, Wundt and Pavlov inspired other behaviorists such as John Watson and B.F. Skinner, who also viewed human beings as animals to be trained, and Watson even conducted cruel experiments on infants. Skinner believed that all behavior could be manipulated, and this inhuman attitude serves the consortium well. Skinner even conducted experiments on his own daughter, isolating her in a box in which all environmental aspects could be strictly controlled, in order to study her like a laboratory rat. Can you imagine doing that with your own kid? Since 1948, $19 billion of taxpayers' money has been paid out by the U.S. Institute of Mental Health solely for behavioral research. The people truly fund their own enslavement. Now, Pavlov's, what was called Pavlovian conditioning, became the foundation for behavioral science, and this conditioning is practiced on all levels of cultural society today and is mostly psychological in nature. Human beings are conditioned through television, mass media, traditional or familial constructs, right? Religious ideologies, political affiliations, societal memes and paradigms, belief systems, and what we courageously call education. We have been trained to distrust our own inner sovereignty and intelligence and to look to the nearest authority to tell us what is right, what is true, what is believable, and exactly what to think. We have been trained to embrace a hyper left-brained cognition with materialism as the forefront, and critical thinking has become all but extinct within the average person. No, most people just blindly accept what some perceived authority tells them to accept. This is dangerous. It's so dangerous. Think for yourself. Think for yourself. No matter if people think you're crazy. Who the fuck cares? Be individual. This whole shit of drugging the population is to create a collective hive mind mentality. Don't buy it. Now, as Jack Trout has aptly claimed, The sane person constantly analyzes the world of reality and then changes what's inside his or her head to fit the facts. Well, that's an awful lot of trouble for most people. Besides, how many people want to constantly change their opinions to fit the facts? It's a whole lot easier to change the facts to fit your opinions. Unsane people make up their minds and they find the facts to verify their opinions. Or even more commonly, they accept the opinion of the nearest expert and then they don't have to bother about the facts at all. Now, the early behavioral experimentation on human beings also inspired such horrific programs as the CIA's MK Ultra, in which people were mercilessly abused to be the victims of insane mind control experiments. Nazi scientists, eugenicists, and psychiatrists were extricated into the U.S., by the way, with a lot of cooperation and assistance from the Vatican during the time after World War II. This extricating of the Nazi scientists and eugenicists with help from the Vatican after World War II, this was called Operation Paperclip. You could look that up. It was from, and, people think that idea is crazy. Of course it happened. The Nazis had some brilliant minds, twisted, but brilliant nonetheless. Who funded the Nazi movement anyway? Fucking Wall Street. It was from behaviorism that the eugenics movement and the transhumanism philosophy were born. Now, transhumanism seeks to merge silicon and carbon, or man and machine, believing that technology can overcome human limitations. It removes spirit from the equation, basically. This philosophy is completely fixated on the five senses and the physical, completely discounting any spiritual component to the human being and leaving consciousness out of the equation. In his amazing work, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, social psychologist Erich Fromm gives his views on the flaws of behaviorism. He said, "Behaviorists claim that their method is scientific because they deal with what is visible, such as with overt behavior. But they do not recognize that behavior itself, separated from the behaving person, cannot be adequately described." Now, the attitude of the transhumanist philosophy can be summed up in a statement made in 1993 by San Diego University professor of computer science Vernon Vinge, when he said, "We are on the edge of change comparable to the rise of human life on Earth. Within 30 years, we will have the technological means to create superhuman intelligence. Shortly after, the human era will end." Vinge was talking about the entrance into the post-human era, which we are currently teetering on the precipice of right now. Now, the term post-humanism means after humanism. Post means after, where mankind will be reduced to the level of an organic machine, and we're dangerously close to witnessing the birth of this dystopian, anti-human society. This is the consortium's idea of an ideal society, one in which robotic half-humans have lost their free will and mindlessly serve their twisted masters. Think of the mentality behind this, and then realize that this is the current consciousness that controls the world. This imbalance is a parasite on everything that it means to be human. Now, around 1890, the idea of brain surgery to control behavior began in Germany when Friedrich Goels showed that dogs became less aggressive by destroying portions of the animal's temporal lobes. Well, I imagine that they would. Think of the psychopathy. Wow, look what we've discovered, that when you destroy an animal's temporal lobes, it's less aggressive. Who would have thought? This is what built this industry, ladies and gentlemen, this kind of psychopathy. It wasn't long before other researchers picked up on the idea and began experimentation on human beings. Oh, of course. In 1935, Carlisle Jacobson of Yale University, home of the Skull and Bone Society, adopted these techniques and performed them on chimps. He found that the animals became more docile, which appears to be a logical outcome when portions of the frontal lobes of the brain are destroyed. These nightmarish procedures eventually became known as the lobotomy. These professional Frankenstein doctors could not hold a candle to Walter Freeman, who performed many thousands of lobotomies. Freeman developed what came to be known as the transorbital lobotomy, or the more aptly named ice pick lobotomy. Where his predecessors had taken better care when performing these horrific procedures, Freeman found that he could jam a long, thin tool that resembled an ice pick through the tear duct and tap it through the bone with a mallet. Think about that for a second. A long ice pick tool inserted into the tear duct of the eyes and tapped through with a mallet to go through the bone. And then once inserted, he would swipe the tool back and forth, effectively destroying the nerves in the prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobes of the brain. Now, there's a PBS documentary called The Lobotomist, and the viewer can see film clips of some of these disgusting procedures being performed on people. I recommend keeping a sick bag handy if you watch it. It's just pseudo-quack. It's disturbing. In Freeman's monstrous procedures, he would first render the victim unconscious with high voltage through the use of what he called the electroconvulsive shock machine. Viewing the film clips of Freeman in action is disturbing and enough to make the stomach turn upside down. This quack's torturous procedure took about 4 minutes to perform. Just as today, as so many are willing to consume drugs which destroy parts of the brain, there were many willing victims of Freeman's butchery. Freeman even suggested and used the lobotomy to treat depression. I mean, can you imagine that? Hey, doc, I'm feeling depressed. Can you jam an ice pick into my brain? I'm reminded again of a quote by Carl Jung, and this kind of spells it out. Jung said, "Human beings will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Lobotomies were also performed on many children. Just as in today's world, many children are given psychotropic drugs, in many cases simply to make them more docile. Freeman even performed a lobotomy on a 4-year-old child. But Freeman's most infamous procedure was a botched lobotomy performed on John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary Kennedy, which left her brain dead. Now, despite this, Freeman embarked on a national campaign in which he traveled the U.S. in a vehicle he dubbed the Lobotomobile, visiting institutions and teaching the methods of his sick procedures. Many lobotomies were performed right out of his van, in which he used electroshock to the head in order to induce seizures in his victims, which would render them unconscious. Now, can you imagine receiving induced convulsions to the point of unconsciousness just prior to having an ice pick thrust into your brain? No, me neither. And Freeman charged $25 for this wonderful service. My question is this: who was the true psychotic, Freeman or his victims? In 1942, Freeman and his partner, the neurosurgeon James Watts, published results of their research on over 200 lobotomies performed. Of those procedures, 23% remained unchanged, and 14% of their patients were actually worse after surgery, the report showed. Eventually, Watts ended his partnership with Freeman due to the cruelty that he had witnessed and that he had been involved in. By the end of his career, Freeman had performed roughly 3,400 transorbital lobotomies around the U.S., and get this, with no surgical training. He retired soon after killing a patient in California who suffered a brain hemorrhage after receiving Freeman's miracle treatment, like so many others had. And by his own admission, 25% of Freeman's patients wound up in a vegetative state. 25% wound up in a vegetative state. Between 40,000 and 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the U.S. between 1939 and 1951. And ladies and gentlemen, historically speaking, that is not a long time ago. Now, around 1950, the drug Thorazine was marketed as a chemical lobotomy, quote. and was widely distributed, despite its severe adverse effects. Permanent brain damage was often the result. Its purpose was to disable normal brain functioning. Well, today, we've got SSRIs and Ritalin, fluoride in the water, and a myriad of other means to prevent the human being from realizing his true potential. In an eerily prophetic statement, psychiatrist Nathan Klein, a pioneer in the use of pharmacological drugs, wrote in 1967 in a conference report, he said, "The present breadth of drug use may be almost trivial when we compare it to the possible number of chemical substances that will be available for the control of selective aspects of man's life in the year 2000. And in 1961, member of the Fabian Society, Aldous Huxley, told us what was coming when he wrote, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods, and this seems to be the final revolution." A campaign of advertising and public relations was launched touting the magic of new psychiatric miracle drugs, and psychiatry became joined at the hip with the pharmaceutical industry. Well, business is booming, with tens of millions of people worldwide taking SSRIs. The catalyst for this mass drugging was the pseudo-scientific idea that all mental illness is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. And again, there are no chemical tests to determine any chemical imbalances, but it sounds good, so let the mass lobotomizing commence. In 1991, an investigation ensued to examine the plethora of reports of violence and death related to psychotropic drugs after enormous public outcry and pressure from the FDA. A panel of psychiatrists, most of which with ties to pharmaceutical companies, was assembled to review all of the evidence. Of course, the panel found no evidence linking antidepressant use to the hundreds of deaths being investigated. Of course they didn't find any. Now, existentialist philosophers and psychologists understand anxiety as a primal urging to live life authentically. In our culture, which constantly seeks to conform the individual to fit into the narrow confines of the status quo, how many people are truly individuals living authentic lives? Well, not many, to be sure. Living an authentic life in which one is true to oneself takes enormous courage, and far too few will dare to venture outside of the imposed and limiting confines that societal mores and memes have provided us with. Those brave few that do are at once hassled by those within the cage or viewed as crazy, wrong, weird, dangerous, or simply as a threat. Humanity polices and enslaves itself and remains immensely intolerant of those that seek to break away from the norms and to live authentically. Those who remain fearful of challenging their own beliefs, right, or of stepping outside of the box, act as gatekeepers for those few souls that do step outside of the pathetically limiting norms of society. Anxiety is a call to step into one's true beingness and to live true to oneself and break the chains of conformity. Of course, there are great penalties for doing so, such as being rejected, ridiculed, discounted, scorned, labeled, hated, feared, and the list could go on. Is it not completely worth the price to pay for the reward of living one's life authentically? Now, as the brilliant existentialist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche stated, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." True anxiety calls us to examine our lives and to step into our own true selves. As with depression, so many seek to avoid the pain that comes when anxiety arises and instead seek to medicate it out of existence with tranquilizer drugs such as Xanax. Our greatest teachers, anxiety and depression, show up to tell us that the temple is collapsing, and we murder them in order to maintain our false, ego-centered illusions. The results are inner chaos and existential death, because until those anxieties and depressions are embraced, the totality of the being remains incomplete. Now again, I've personally witnessed the results of this avoidance and drugging with people who've come in and out of my life, and the results were never pretty. Usually what remained was an empty shell of a person I once thought I knew, and sometimes death was the result. It is sad, and unfortunately it's rampant. Now Xanax is a benzodiazepine drug commonly prescribed to treat anxiety, and like SSRIs, there are many adverse effects associated with its use. Among them are dependency, memory loss, decreased IQ, personality changes, and sedation. Drugs seem to be the answer for so many people. Any uncomfortable feelings that arise are readily treated with addictive and destructive medications. The owners and CEOs of the pharmaceutical companies are laughing all the way to the bank. Any visible adverse effects caused by these drugs are usually treated with yet more drugs. The control paradigms that govern this reality are illusory ego constructs. They are breaking down. The breakdown of the outer structures is a reflection of the breakdown of the inner structures. Anyone paying attention can clearly observe the increasing intensity of breakdown occurring. The rising increase in people seeking powerful, destructive medications to alleviate the symptoms of this breakdown has reached staggering numbers and is growing exponentially. The false reality that so many have bought into is coming apart at the seams, which appears to be literally driving people mad. This complete and utter collapse of civilization brings with it great opportunity for humanity. We will be challenged to face the force of our own destructiveness and release our fear-based attachments to the material. This breakdown is calling us to look within, yet far too many run from this challenge and would rather destroy a part of themselves than turn their focus within to where the problems and the solutions truly dwell. They are prisoners of the ego and cut off from the totality of the true self. They are existentially dead. A system born of and sustained by ego consciousness is temporary and unsustainable and has its own collapse written into its very structure and nature. It is also an immense teacher. The masses remain in a fear-based consciousness, rushing about mindlessly, straining to prop up the collapsing ego-centered consciousness, which has a finite life cycle. It is futile to do so. People wish to cling tightly to that which enslaves them. It's the ego that fears. It is the ego mind that perceives and buys into the idea of separation. It is the ego that feeds a survivalist mindset and maintains deep attachment to the material plane. Now, the ego was born of trauma, and it behaves like a neurotic child, shivering in the cold, desperately trying to hang on to its false constructs. The ego does not go willingly. I believe that the reason for this collective madness associated with the breakdown of egoic consciousness and the subsequent outer collapse is that people believe themselves to be the ego. People are so heavily locked into ego consciousness that they have forgotten that ego is simply one aspect of the personality. Most are completely unaware of even a concept of the unconscious mind or the higher true self. Now, higher mind seeks to embrace the ego, not destroy it. But the majority, stuck in fear, will literally crack as the ego wanes, because that's the only thing they identify with, this mechanism they think their thoughts with. So as it wanes, they're going to think they're going crazy, and they will suffer breakdown. They will seek all manner of escape and distraction from this process, which will only make them fall in the end. Don't worry about them. For the seekers and the few that understand where we are and where we're headed, you need not try to prop up those who are falling. They too have had every opportunity to step into the totality of their true being and instead chose to turn from it or try to drug it away with brain-altering chemicals. They will most likely suffer the most inner trauma in the days ahead. Now, I feel for those who have no conceptual understanding that we are so much more than the false ego construct that so many believe themselves to be. If they refuse to embrace the coming changes and fight to cling on to the collapsing structures, inner and outer, they will fall hard and could very well suffer complete psychological breakdown. And we see this happening at an increasingly alarming pace. Where so many who are stuck within ego consciousness see only crisis, a few see opportunity. We stand at the crossroads of the greatest opportunity ever presented to humanity. We see what happens in a world where ego runs amok. In its fear-based, isolated quest for physical survival, the false ego has created the matrix which has brought us face to face with our very extinction. Only a mind entrapped within ego-centered consciousness can deny this blatantly obvious truth. You may cling to your distractions, drug yourself into oblivion, or expand outwards and inwards into the totality of what you truly are, which is an amazingly divine, magnificent being with infinite potential. Examine your intimate relationships because you may notice the breakdown there first before you notice it in the wider world or within yourself. This is a calling to turn within and recreate oneself. May you choose wisely. I want to repeat that one thing again because this sums up the reason for all these drugs and all the control mechanisms, okay? You may cling to your distractions, drug yourself into oblivion, or expand outwards and inwards into the totality of what you truly are, which is an amazingly divine, magnificent being with infinite potential. That's why the mass drugging, that's why the psychological control, that's why all the poisons in the food supply, to stifle your magnificence. And I'll leave you with a couple of quotes today. First, from the existentialist philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. He said, "The most common form of despair is not being who you are." And then E. Cummings, "To be nobody but myself in a world which is doing its best night and day to make me somebody else means to fight the hardest battle any human can fight and never stop fighting." And Barbara DeAngelis, "We need to find the courage to say no to the things and people that are not serving us if we want to rediscover ourselves and live our lives with authenticity." And then M. Scott Peck said, "The truth is that our finest moments are most likely to occur when we are feeling deeply uncomfortable, unhappy, or unfulfilled. For it is only in such moments, propelled by our discomfort, that we are likely to step out of our ruts and start searching for different ways to truer answers." And then Victoria Jane Reynolds said, "Being authentic is the ability to be true to oneself. Living an authentic life requires the ability to be true to our own wants, needs, and desires, and not live our lives by the opinion of others. Being authentic is the ability to make self-honoring choices and stand firmly in who we are in our core. Being true to ourselves gives us the insight and compassion to see others for who they are, not who we expect them to be. It frees us up from the judgment of ourselves and others, and it gives others the freedom to be themselves as well." And this is from the Journal of American Medical Association, Volume 284, Number 4, John Hopkins School of Hygiene and Public Health, and it reads, "Out of the 783,936 annual deaths from conventional medicine mistakes, approximately 106,000 of those are the result of prescription drug use. According to the Journal of the American Medical Association, 290 people in the United States are killed by prescription drugs every day. And then again, Aldous Huxley, Fabian Society, this guy should know. And he said, the real hopeless victims of mental illness are to be found among those who appear to be most normal. Many of them are normal because they are so well adjusted to our mode of existence, because their human voice has been silenced so early in their lives that they do not even struggle or suffer or develop symptoms as the neurotic does. They are normal not in what may be called the absolute sense of the word. They are normal only in relation to a profoundly abnormal society. Their perfect adjustment to that abnormal society is a measure of their mental sickness. These millions of abnormally normal people living without fuss in a society to which, if they were fully human beings, they ought not to be adjusted. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to open your mind and search for the truth and listen to Awaken the Age of Revealing. More to come. This is Doug Michael. Talk to you soon. Walk in peace.